So we're in a fall series where we're looking at passages about stubborn faith and about consistent faithfulness. These aren't the passages we tend to turn to in the Bible. We're always attracted to passages in the Bible that have to do with miraculous answered prayers or bold actions or earth-shaking changes. So those are the things we like to look at. But even though the Bible has a lot of that, and it's good to look at those passages, there's a lot more in the Bible about very ordinary people. People like Malchijah. Now, I bet you've never heard a sermon about Malchijah. I bet you've never read a book that was completely committed to the study of Malchijah. But he plays an important role. His one-line claim to fame shows up in the middle of a chapter you probably don't remember reading. It's Nehemiah Chapter 3. Now, your first impression of the third chapter of Nehemiah when you get into it is that it's just a long list of hard-to-pronounce names of people who are involved in an ordinary construction project. I imagine you know the story of Nehemiah. In his day, the people were starting to return back from Babylonian exile to occupy the promised land, Israel, again. And Nehemiah realized that one of the very first things that needed to happen was the demolished wall around Jerusalem needed to be rebuilt. It had been demolished when the Babylonians came in 70 years earlier. And for the people's pride, but also more importantly for their protection, this is one of the first things. There were a lot of things that needed to be done in rebuilding Jerusalem and getting things back in operation again. But this was the most important, getting this wall built. Now, there are a lot of books that are written about the leadership principles that we can learn from this man Nehemiah. There are leadership courses that you can take about the principles we learn from the book of Nehemiah. But Nehemiah would not have gotten anywhere without the activities and the actions of the men who were listed in Nehemiah chapter 3. For 32 verses, we just have this long list of people who joined Nehemiah in the work that he led. It's just simply a list of names and what portion of the wall that they built. And so one man led a crew to repair 500 yards of wall from the valley gate. Another man led in rebuilding the section from the king's garden to the tombs of David, and on it goes. Now, if you look at this chapter really carefully, you see that it both begins and ends at the exact same spot, the sheep gate. And what that means is Nehemiah chapter 3 is sort of the manuscript of the narration of a tour guide. And so he starts at one point, the sheep gate, and he just goes around, he goes with you around the walls of Jerusalem, pointing out the different parts that were built by the different people. And by the end of the chapter, you're back to where you began, the sheep gate, which is showing in Nehemiah chapter 3 that the entirety of this wall finally got completed. How did it happen? How did it finally get completed? Because each person listed in chapter 3 stepped up and committed to building their little section of the wall. And here's where Malchijah caught my attention. Let's look at Nehemiah chapter 3. Verse 14 says, "The dung gate was repaired by Malchijah, son of Rechab, ruler of the district of Beth Hakerem. He rebuilt it and put its doors with their bolts and bars in place." Now, in this chapter, the sections of the wall of Jerusalem are referred to by which gates, which points of entry they are by. And so you have the section at the sheep gate, and the section at the fish gate, and the section at the Jeshanah gate. And Malchijah's part was a section of the wall by the dung gate. How would you like to be known forever as the dung gate guy? It's the only thing we know about Malchijah. Actually, there are two Malchijahs in Nehemiah chapter 3. There's one in verse 11, and then there's the one we're looking at here in verse 14. And that means that the name was probably a pretty common name at the time, Malchijah. It's sort of like John or Paul. In our church, we have a lot of Johns. We have a lot of Pauls. If we had a few Ringos and Georges, we'd be in business, you know. We have a lot of people who are named by those very common names. Well, that was the way it was in the Old Testament. Malchijah was a pretty common name. It sounds odd to us, but it was common. A lot of people had that name. Malchijah means Jehovah is king. And so wouldn't that be an appropriate name for a boy if you're trying to come up with a name for a boy? But now here's the big difference between these two Malchijahs in Nehemiah chapter 3. The one in verse 11, he built his section near the tower of the ovens. And the one in verse 14, he built his section of the wall near the dung gates. The tower of the ovens, you know what that means? He built a section of the wall next to a bakery. Have you ever lived near a bakery where they're baking fresh bread? It's wonderful, isn't it? We had a man in our church at one time. He and his wife, when they were young adults, she did the early shift at a donut shop. And they told me the story of she would come home from that shift and he would sort of gather her up in his arms and hold her close, and she would say, "Boy, somebody's glad to see me." And he said, "You smell like donuts." It's wonderful to be the Malchijah building next to a bakery. But there was another aroma wafting by the Malchijah next to verse 14. Now, this passageway, this dung gate, it was an important part of the sacrificial system. It needed to happen that somebody handled this portion of the wall. In the sacrificial system, when an animal was sacrificed, the entrails, the offal, the stuff that made somebody unclean, it had to be taken away. And it had to be taken away that would keep somebody ceremonially clean to be able to worship. It had to be taken away so that the sacrifices would be ceremonial clean. It was an important part of the sacrificial system, but still, would you want to just pass it down from generation to generation that your family were the dung gate people? But now, what would have happened had Malchijah of verse 14 refused to step up and do his part? There would have been this gap in the wall in Jerusalem. No matter how well built the rest of the wall was, as long as there is this big gap right there, the enemy still had a way to get in, right? And so he had to step up and do his part. I think one of the things that I can learn from a study of Malchijah is just simply to ask myself the question, where is my little bit of the wall that I'm responsible for? Where is the little portion of God's ministry, God's mission in this church that I am responsible to fulfill, and then do it well and do it consistently? I want you to think about this. Plodding is a superpower. Now, if you have this superpower, Marvel will probably never do a movie about you, but it's still a superpower. And if that's the case, if you just realize that just day in and day out doing the right thing and doing it well is a superpower, you need to understand that there are two things that serve as kryptonite that will drain you of your superpower. You can see in your sermon notes the two things I've written down. One is individualism, radical individualism. For some of us, our faith suffers from this. We think that the Christian faith is all about Jesus and me, and that's it. You know, being involved in a church, being part of God's people, that's a nice option if it helps you, but you're not really focused on how you can be of service to the people of God. You know, it's all based on what a church can do for you. And I think that's what's behind so many of the surveys today that indicate there are a lot of people that still identify themselves as Christians, but they're not involved in any sort of church because they're wrapped up in individualism. But Ephesians chapter 5 says that Jesus loved the church and gave himself up for her. How can you say that you are crazy about Jesus if you're not crazy about the things that he is crazy about? How can you say that you love Jesus if you don't love the things that he loved? Now, for some people, this radical individualism doesn't just stop there and just apathetic uninvolvement. It goes so far as to be a constant carping critic of the church at large. It's one thing after another on social media. It's one thing after another about what's wrong with the church today. Now, let me ask you as husbands, have you ever had one of those slip-ups in your life where you said the wrong thing that sounded very much like a criticism of your wife? I'm not talking about me. It's never happened to me. But I'm just wondering if it's happened to you. There's a few years ago, there was a Sonic commercial of a husband and wife sitting in the front seat, and they were enjoying their milkshakes. And then the slip-up. Let's watch.
Man, I love that Sonic has iced lattes now. It's so good.
Hey, I have a mustache.
Honey, you can only see it in sunlight. Don't worry about it. Hey, you have a mustache on you right now. Only now. No other times, just now.
Iced lattes. Knew it, son.
All right. So if you've had a moment like that, you know this guy is going to be paying for that for a long, long time, right? But now think about this. If you had a friend who was constantly carping on your wife, her appearance and the mannerisms and so on, wouldn't you eventually go, I wonder if this guy's really a friend of mine? He doesn't care about the things that I care about. This is an election season right now. Of course, in this portion of history we're in America right now, what isn't an election season? But during the election season, it's dismaying to me to get on social media and watch people who feel like they have a perfect liberty to talk not just about the candidate they dislike, but about the candidate's wife or husband. And so they'll criticize her appearance or her mannerisms and the way she speaks and so on. Now, here's the interesting thing. The campaign manager for that candidate, he never does that. All those people who show up at the rallies for the candidate, they never do that. Who does that? The person who doesn't like the candidate. Now, I wonder if somebody who just makes this constant, relentless, carping criticism about the church, in the end just doesn't like the husband the church is married to. I wonder if that isn't the case. Now, I don't mean by that there's never a time to criticize a particular church for a particular thing. No church, no group filled with human beings is ever beyond and above criticism. So I don't mean that. But you're doing it wrong, you're criticizing wrong if this is what ends up happening. If you do it in such a way that you and other people are no longer involved in any sort of church. If you and other people are no longer involved in leadership in any sort of church. If you and other people are no longer involved in supporting any other church, then you're doing it wrong when it comes to criticizing and constantly carping. Malchijah strikes a blow against our radical individualism. If you think about it, Nehemiah Chapter 3 is one of the most corporate chapters in the Bible. And what I mean by that is, when you read through Nehemiah Chapter 3, you don't just see a bunch of spiritual individualists just going off and doing their own thing, whatever feels right to them to do. No, they're working in a united way to do something that can benefit the people God loves. And in that way, Nehemiah chapter 3 is a foreshadowing of everything that we see in the New Testament about the church, because the church, we are told in the New Testament letters, is a place that we are to work together for the sake of the people God loves. But now I said that Malchijah strikes at two infections rampant among Christians today. One is radical individualism, and the other is grandiosity. You know what grandiosity is? Grandiosity is this idea of seeing yourself as more important than maybe you really are. And I do understand, as we move into adulthood, those early years of adulthood, this doesn't strike everybody, but for most of us, it really happened in our early years of adulthood. We wanted to be extraordinary, right? We wanted to do something notable and noteworthy. It wasn't enough just to be ordinary, like our parents or like our aunts and uncles or like the people that raised us in Sunday school. We want to be extraordinary. Here's what Lori Ferguson Wilbert wrote just a month ago. She said, "I am of the don't waste your life generation. A generation of young people in the church who believe their greatest call was not to settle for mediocrity in their Christian life. Passion was the proof of their salvation. Zeal was the evidence of our faith. Send me was our mantra, and world changers was our identity." Get this, we all wanted to be used by God, but none of us wanted to fold up the chairs afterwards. Well, that's a good observation. Malchijah did not suffer from grandiosity, which is interesting because he was a pretty grand man himself. Did you notice this? Here in verse 14, it says that he was ruler of the district of Beth Hakkerem. And yet he is forever identified as the guy who built the dung gate. A lot of us who maybe reach a certain level of importance in the community, in the secular world, in our work, we wouldn't have maybe lowered ourselves in our mind to take on a job like this, but it didn't look like he hesitated to do it at all. So radical individualism, grandiosity. These things will serve as kryptonite to drain you of your superpower. But Malchijah had neither of these problems. He is a biblical example of the power of plodding. Here's what Kevin DeYoung wrote in an article sometime back. Let me get to this. He said, "It is easy to blast the church for all her failures. It is harder to live in the church day after day, year after year, with all the ho-hum, humdrum, and to slowly and consistently make a difference. What we need," he says, "are fewer revolutionaries and a few more plodding visionaries. Many of us are attracted to a Tasmanian devil kind of Christianity." You know what he's referring to there? Some of us, you remember the Bugs Bunny cartoons with the Tasmanian devil whirling all around. So he says many of us are attracted to a Tasmanian devil kind of Christianity, splattering and spinning all around. You get fired up and spin out like the Tasmanian devil, ready to conquer the world for Christ. But then you blow up into a tree somewhere. We need plodding visionaries. Get on the right road and keep going. He continued to write, "Our volunteer jobs at church are often mundane. Our devotional times often seem like a waste. Church services are often forgettable. That's life. We drive to the same places, go through the same routines with the kids, buy the same groceries at the store, share a bed with the same person every night. Church is often the same too. Same doctrine, same basic order of worship, same preacher, same people. But in all the smallness and sameness, God works like the smallest seed in the garden, growing to unbelievable heights. Like beloved Tychicus, that faithful minister Paul mentions in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 2, who delivered Paul's mail. Life is usually pretty ordinary, just like following Jesus most days. Daily discipleship is not a new revolution each morning or an agent of global transformation every evening. It's a long obedience in the same direction." Now there's that phrase again, a long obedience in the same direction. I introduced that phrase to you last week. It comes from the title of a famous book by the late Eugene Peterson, which says that the way we progress in life is just through a long obedience, going in the same direction. When Kevin DeYoung wrote about plodding visionaries, he probably didn't have in mind William Carey, but he could have. William Carey was raised in an obscure rural village in the middle of England in the 18th century. He apprenticed at a local cobbler's shop, and so he spent his young adult years making shoes and repairing shoes. When he was converted to Christ, he wanted to start studying the New Testament in the original Greek, don't we all? And so he got a Greek grammar, and he taught himself Greek. After that, he found that he was proficient in languages, and so he taught himself Hebrew and Latin as well. He also had a passion for international affairs. He had this huge map of the world that he put up on the wall, and while he was cobbling shoes, he would look up at this map and think about what the cultures were like over here, and what the politics were like over here, and what the religious views were over here, and he just tried to study as much as he could about the international world. Carey became a Baptist pastor, and in 1792, he formed a missions organization that kind of fueled and developed out his missions passion. And he would go around and talk with people about supporting international missions and going as an international missionary themselves. And eventually, he surrendered to his own call. He decided to become a missionary himself. And so one day, with another Englishman and also with Carey's wife and children, they boarded a ship headed for India. Now, Carey's first years there in India were miserable. The one other man who had come with him on the trip, he abandoned them, returned to England, and illness racked his family, and loneliness and regret set in. He wrote in his diary at one point, "I am in a strange land, no Christian friend, a large family, and nothing to supply their wants." But then he added in the diary, "Well, I have God, and his word is sure." When Carey contracted malaria, and at the same time his 5-year-old son Peter died of dysentery, that was too much for his wife Dorothy, and she had a mental breakdown. And she, for months after that, years after that, she suffered under terrible paranoia. She accused Carey, her husband, of repeatedly going into adulterous relationships with other people. At one point, she threatened him with a knife, And eventually her doctor had to physically restrain her inside the house. In his diary, Carey wrote, "This is indeed the valley of the shadow of death for me, but I rejoice that I'm here notwithstanding, and God is here." He learned one of the local languages, Bengali, with the help of a local person. And in a few weeks, he began translating the Bible. Remember, he had taught himself Greek and Hebrew, so he began to translate out of Greek and Hebrew into the Bengali language. And he started preaching to small gatherings. And in December 1800, 7 years after laboring, he baptized his first converts. And he celebrated that, but hardships as well as progress continued. One of the most devastating setbacks for him happened in a warehouse fire in 1812. By then, he had created by hand a massive dictionary in all his linguistic efforts, various versions of the Bible in various Indian languages, and 2 grammar books. And it all went up in flames in this warehouse fire. There was no way of making copies back then. All of it was gone. Nevertheless, he saw it as from the hand of the Lord, and he just picked up his pen and started all over again, and all of that stuff that had been destroyed. He never took a furlough back to England. He stayed in India for 40 years, translating the entire Bible into 6 major Indian languages and parts of the Bible in 209 other smaller tribal languages. Now, how was he able to do it? William Carey has maybe one of the most famous lines. You may have read it before. He said, "Expect great things from God and attempt great things for God." You may have seen that before. And I imagine he lived by that motto. But I imagine what kept him going was a motto you probably haven't heard before. This is what Carey wrote: "I can plod. I can persevere to any definite pursuit. To this I owe everything." Carey was an 18th century Malchijah. And now you and I are called on to be 21st century Malchijahs. Now who knows? You may, by the grace of God, be enlisted by him to be a Nehemiah instead of a Malchijah. Nehemiah was the man who led this entire great effort. He had the book named after him. But most of us are more likely to be called to be Malchijahs instead of Nehemiahs. So, young mom, keep bringing your kids to church. You're doing your part to build the wall. And children's worker, keep showing up to do the thing you signed on to do. You're doing your little part to build the wall. And faithful deacon, faithful life group leader, you keep doing your part to contact those absentees and those prospects. You're doing your little part to build the wall. Faithful prayer, keep praying. Faithful giver, keep giving. You're each doing your little part to build the wall. In that article, Kevin DeYoung wrote about plodding visionaries, and he didn't end the article without getting just downright practical about things you can do to keep going with what needs to be done. And so let me read some of the things he tells you to do. Become a member of the church you're attending. Stay there as long as you can. Attend every Sunday you can and worship in spirit and truth. Be patient with your leaders. Rejoice when the gospel is faithfully proclaimed. Bear with those who hurt you. Give people the benefit of the doubt. Say hi to the teenager that no one notices. Welcome the old ladies with gray hair and the young men with tattoos. Volunteer for the nursery. Attend the congregational meeting. Bring your fried chicken to the potluck like everybody else. Invite a friend. Take a new couple out for coffee. Give to the Christmas offering. Sing like you mean it. Be thankful that someone vacuumed the carpet for you. Enjoy the Sundays that click. Pray extra hard on the Sundays that don't. And in all of this, do not despise the day of small beginnings, as Zechariah chapter 4 tells us. Malchijah did what was necessary in service to the people of God. And in that way, he was a forerunner. He was someone who demonstrated what somebody a lot more important than him would come to do. And I'm speaking about Jesus Christ. You remember in our study through the Gospel of John that the night before Jesus went to the cross, at the Lord's Supper, he washed his disciples' feet. Do you remember that story? It was a necessary component of hospitality at that time. The roads weren't paved anywhere in the first century world, and everybody walked everywhere, and they walked with open sandals. And so when they showed up at a house, their feet were dusty or caked with mud, and it was the responsibility of someone in the house, usually the lowest servant, to take those sandals off as people come in and take a wash basin and wash the mud and off their feet, wash the dust from between their toes, and that way they could enjoy time in the house. And Jesus was sitting around the Lord's Supper, and he saw all these men of his with dirty feet, because nobody thought they were menial enough, small enough, to do this little task for each other. And so what did Jesus do? He got a wash basin, he got a towel, and he knelt down before each of his apostles and washed their feet. Now, if you're looking in that chapter, if you examine it, you'll see that Jesus did this for two reasons, not one, but for two. One of the things he was doing was preparing them to understand the cross. He was going to go to the cross the next day. He, in many ways, he wanted to show them what this was all about. And in washing their feet of mud, he wanted them to know that he had come to this earth to wash their souls at the cross. And so this is one of the reasons why Jesus was doing this. But then after Jesus did this for them, he said, now that your Lord and Master has done this for you, you do it for each other. And so there was another reason, a second reason why Jesus washed our feet, to give us a model, give us an example of what the Christian life is like. We're to imitate our Master. We're to follow him in the direction he wants us to go. And so my invitation today is for two groups of people, for those who need to realize what Jesus has done for you and accept his service that he performed for you. He died on the cross to take away your sin. Let him take it away. Let him serve you so that you become a believer. That's what it means to become a believer. Christianity isn't about finding a list of hard things we can do to prove our love for Jesus. Christianity is about recognizing that one great thing he did to show his love for us. And we yield to that, and we accept that, and we become Christians by faith. But then there's another group of people here I want to extend an invitation to, and that's to most of us who have received that work of Jesus. We are believers. We believe that he has forgiven us by the cross. But Jesus said, after he washed his apostles' feet, he said, now that I've done this for you, you do it for each other. And now we have the responsibility to be Malchijahs for each other, just doing the ordinary things that need to be done so that God's people are served. Let's go to the Lord in prayer and ask him to help us with this. Dear Jesus, I pray for that person listening right now who needs to accept your service for them. The message of Christianity isn't about what we do to prove our love to you, but what you did out of your love for us. And I pray then that the person who needs to say, Jesus, thank you for dying for my sins, make me clean inside, I pray that if they have the need to say that and become Christians today, that they would do it. They would say yes to you. And I also pray for those who have received your service for us, and now we need to serve others like you did. Like Malchijah, help us to be willing to do whatever needs doing and do it well in a long obedience in the same direction. Amen.